"Translate it if you can," the German millionaire said, and as a waitress, I answered in his own language. I never thought the day I'd be spoken down to in a language foreign to me would turn into the moment I found my voice. The German millionaire smirked, his cold eyes daring me with those words that cut deeper than any blade. "Maybe you're serving tables for people who don't appreciate it, or cleaning up after everyone else has left. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise today's story will touch your heart." I still remember that crisp October morning in Manhattan. The autumn air carried the familiar scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh bagels from the corner deli. Steam rose from manholes like ghostly fingers reaching toward the gray sky. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Astoria Bistro on the Upper East Side, my breath still visible in the morning chill. "My name is Helen. I'm 55 years old, and for the past 6 years, I've been invisible. Not literally, of course. But when you're a waitress in one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, you become part of the scenery, like the crystal chandeliers or the imported Italian marble floors. People look through you, around you, but never at you." The weight of my black apron felt heavier that morning. My hands, marked with small burns from countless coffee pots and serving plates, trembled slightly as I tied the strings behind my back. The fabric was fraying at the edges, just like my spirit had been for years. I caught my reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine. Tired eyes stared back at me. When had those lines around my mouth become so deep? When had my shoulders learned to curve inward, as if trying to make myself smaller, less noticeable? The Astoria Bistro wasn't just any restaurant. It was where Wall Street executives brought their clients, where fashion designers discussed million-dollar deals over $30 appetizers, where cryptocurrency millionaires flashed their wealth like peacocks showing their feathers. The menu prices could feed my family for a week. A single bottle of wine cost more than I made in 3 days. I walked past tables set with gleaming silverware and crisp white linens. Each place setting represented more money than I saw in a month. The crystal glasses caught the light from the chandeliers, sending rainbow fragments dancing across the walls. Beautiful, cold, me untouchable, like everything else in that world. My shift started like every other. Check the reservation book. Polish glasses, refill salt shakers, smile, always smile, even when your feet are screaming and your back feels like it might snap in half. The manager, Richard, barely glanced at me as he rattled off the day's specials. His eyes were already scanning for the younger waitresses, the ones who made the wealthy customers linger longer, order more expensive wine. At 55, I had become invisible in ways that cut deeper than any insult, not just because of my age, but because of what I represented. I was the help, the service, the woman who brought your food and disappeared until you needed something else. No one asked about my dreams, my past, my hopes for tomorrow. They saw the apron and stopped seeing the person underneath. But I hadn't always been invisible. Once, long ago, I had been someone else entirely. I had stood in front of classrooms, teaching German literature to eager college students. I had discussions about Goethe and Schiller, translated poetry that made hearts soar, guided young minds through the beauty of a language I loved. I had been Professor Helen Miller then, not just Helen the waitress. Life has a way of stripping away who you were until you forget you were ever anyone at all. My husband left when our son Tommy was 12. The divorce took everything: our house, our savings, my confidence. I had to leave teaching when the stress made me sick, when panic attacks left me gasping for air in front of my students. The bistro job was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of carrying trays laden with food I could never afford. 6 years of listening to conversations about stock portfolios worth millions, while I calculated whether I could afford groceries and rent in the same week. 6 years of watching Bitcoin millionaires argue over investments that could change my life forever, while I counted dollar bills and tips, hoping they'd add up to enough for Tommy's school supplies. The morning crowd was typical for a Tuesday. Business executives grabbing quick breakfasts before meetings that would decide the fate of companies, of families they'd never meet. Hedge fund managers discussing their latest acquisitions between sips of $100 coffee. Real estate moguls planning developments that would push people like me further and further from the city I'd called home for 30 years. I moved between tables like a ghost, refilling coffee cups, clearing plates, answering to snapped fingers and impatient sighs. Mrs. Henderson, a regular who owned a gallery in Soho, never looked up from her phone when she ordered. She spoke to me like I was an extension of the table, functional, forgettable, replaceable. "Coffee, black, toast, dry," she said without lifting her eyes. "No please, no thank you. Just commands issued to a servant who existed only to fulfill them." I poured her coffee with steady hands, though inside I wanted to ask her about the paintings in her gallery, about the artists whose work she championed. I wanted to tell her that I once wrote my master's thesis on German Expressionism, that I could discuss art for hours if anyone cared to listen. But I was just the coffee-pouring woman, and she was the important gallery owner. Our worlds weren't meant to intersect beyond the transaction of service. The morning wore on with its familiar rhythm of humiliation disguised as routine. A young tech entrepreneur left a $5 tip on a $100 breakfast and felt generous. A fashion executive sent back her eggs 3 times, each complaint delivered with theatrical exasperation, as if I had personally ruined her entire day. An oil executive's wife complained that I was too slow, too clumsy, too old to be working in such an establishment. Each slight was small on its own, a dismissive wave, a conversation that stopped when I approached, resuming only after I'd moved away, a failure to make eye contact as if acknowledging my humanity might somehow diminish their own. But together, these moments accumulated like drops of poison, wearing away at whatever dignity I had left. During my break, I sat in the narrow alley behind the restaurant, among dumpsters and delivery trucks. The city noise felt different back there, rawer, more honest than the polished murmur of the dining room. I pulled out my phone to check messages. Tommy, now 18 and in his first year of college, had sent a photo from his dorm room. He looked happy, proud. My baby boy, making his way in the world despite everything I couldn't give him. The college fund I dreamed of had never materialized. Tommy was working 2 part-time jobs while studying, taking loans that would follow him for decades. I'd wanted to give him everything, a house with a yard, family vacations, security. Instead, I'd given him resilience born from watching his mother bend but never break. I thought about calling him, hearing his voice, letting him remind me that I mattered to someone. But what would I say? That I was tired of being treated like furniture? That some days I felt so invisible I wondered if I might actually disappear? That the woman who once taught Kafka's metamorphosis now understood too well what it meant to wake up as something others saw as less than human? Instead, I texted back a heart emoji and went back inside. The afternoon shift was about to begin, and with it would come new faces, new humiliations, new reminders of my place in this carefully ordered world of wealth and want. I had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, everything would change. That a man with cold eyes and expensive suits would challenge me in a way that would force me to remember who I used to be. That the language I'd hidden away like a treasured book would become the key to unlocking a door I thought had been sealed forever. But first, there would be more coffee to pour, more plates to carry, more moments of being less than nothing in the eyes of people who had everything. The afternoon stretched ahead of me like a long corridor with no doors, no windows, no way out. At 2:00, he walked in. Franz Altenberg. Even before I learned his name, I could tell he was different from our usual clientele. Not just wealthy. Manhattan was full of wealthy people. This man carried power like an expensive cologne, subtle but unmistakable. His suit was perfectly tailored, probably worth more than I made in 3 months. His watch caught the light as he gestured, and I glimpsed enough to know it was worth more than my yearly salary. Richard, our manager, practically genuflected as he approached Franz's table. I watched from across the room as he fawned over this new customer, his body language screaming desperate servitude. Franz barely acknowledged him, his attention focused on his phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen in what looked like important business communications. I learned later that Franz Altenberg was what financial magazines called a disruptor. He'd made his first fortune in biotechnology, then multiplied it through strategic investments in cryptocurrency and renewable energy. His portfolio included assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, spread across traditional stocks, Bitcoin holdings that had exploded in value, and real estate investments spanning 3 continents. Forbes had recently featured him in an article about the new generation of European millionaires conquering American markets. But in that moment, all I saw was another wealthy customer who would look through me while I served him. I was wrong about the looking through me part. Richard assigned me to Franz's table, probably because the younger waitresses were busy with their regulars. As I approached, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came with serving the particularly entitled ones. Franz looked up as I neared, and for a moment our eyes met. His were pale blue, calculating, cold as a winter morning in Central Park. "Good afternoon," I said, mustering my professional smile. "Can I start you with something to drink?" He studied me for a long moment, like I was a specimen under a microscope. When he spoke, his accent was slight but unmistakable, German, refined, educated. "Coffee black, and I'll need the lunch menu." His English was perfect, but there was something in his tone that made me feel smaller than usual. Not just dismissive, actively contemptuous, like he was already irritated by having to interact with someone beneath his notice. I brought his coffee and menu, my hands steady despite the unease building in my chest. He ordered without looking at me, rattling off his choices like he was reading a grocery list. Seared scallops, Wagyu beef, a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly rent. "And make sure the scallops are properly seared," he added, finally looking up at me. "I assume you understand what that means?" The question stung, not because it was unreasonable, but because of the way he said it, like he assumed I was too stupid to understand basic cooking terms, like he was prepping to be disappointed by my incompetence. "Of course, sir," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I'll make sure the kitchen knows." As I walked away, I heard him speaking on his phone, switching between English and German. His voice was different in German, more animated, more authoritative. He was discussing some kind of merger, throwing around figures that made my head spin. Millions in assets, cryptocurrency portfolios, international investments that involved more money than I could comprehend. I put in his order and tried to shake off the encounter, but something about Franz Altenberg unsettled me more than usual. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, not through me like most customers, but at me with obvious disdain, like my very existence offended him. The lunch rush picked up, and I fell into the familiar rhythm of service. Check on tables, refill drinks, clear plates, smile at complaints, apologize for problems that weren't my fault, the usual dance of hospitality that kept the machine running smoothly. Franz's food came out beautifully presented, as it always did at the Astoria. Our chef was genuinely talented, even if he treated the waitstaff like servants in his personal fiefdom. I approached Franz's table carefully, balancing the heavy plates with practiced ease. "Seared scallops," I announced, setting the plate before him. The scallops were perfect, golden brown on top, translucent in the center, arranged artfully with microgreens and a delicate sauce. Franz cut into one with his knife, examined it critically, then took a bite. His expression didn't change. No nod of approval, no acknowledgement that the food met his standards. Just cold evaluation, like he was tasting something that had already disappointed him. "The wine," he said without looking up. I poured it carefully, the dark liquid catching the light as it filled his glass. He swirled it, sniffed, tasted. Again, no reaction, just cold consumption of something that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. I was turning to leave when he spoke again. This time, his voice carried a sharper edge. "The service here is slower than I expected," he said, still not looking at me. "In Europe, we have higher standards." The criticism hit like a slap. I'd been moving efficiently, hitting every table in my section, keeping everyone's needs met. There was nothing slow about my service, but I bit back my defense and nodded. "I apologize, sir. Is there anything specific I can do better?" Now he looked up, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach clench. Amusement. He was enjoying this. "Perhaps you could try being more attentive. In Germany, waitstaff understand that anticipating needs is part of proper service." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Of course, sir. I'll do my best to—" "Your best," he interrupted, "seems to be somewhat limited." The words hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette, acrid and lingering. Other diners were starting to notice the exchange. I could feel their eyes on us, some curious, others embarrassed on my behalf. Richard was hovering nearby, clearly aware that one of his important customers was displeased. I took a breath, counted to 3, and smiled. "I apologize if my service hasn't met your expectations. Please let me know how I can improve." Franz leaned back in his chair, studying me with those cold blue eyes. "The problem," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room, "is that you people don't understand quality. You've never experienced real service, so you don't know how to provide it." You people. The phrase hit like a physical blow. Around us, conversations had quieted. Everyone was listening now, waiting to see how this would play out. "I understand," I said quietly, though my hands were shaking slightly as I reached to refill his water glass. "Do you?" Franz asked, and now there was no mistaking the cruelty in his voice. "Because from where I sit, it seems like you're just going through the motions. No passion, no pride in your work, just existing." The word existing fell from his lips like a dismissal of my entire life. I set the water pitcher down carefully, afraid my trembling hands might drop it. "Sir, I take great pride in—" "Pride?" Franz laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "In carrying plates? In pouring water? Tell me, what exactly about this work requires pride?" The dining room was nearly silent now. Even the kitchen noise seemed muted. I stood there, feeling 50 pairs of eyes on me, waiting for my response. My mouth opened, but no words came. What could I say? That serving people like him had slowly crushed whatever pride I'd once had? That every day I swallowed insults and smiled through humiliation because I needed this job to survive? Franz sensed my silence as weakness. He smiled then, a thin, cold expression that never reached his eyes. "You see?" he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the restaurant. No answer, because there is no pride in mediocrity. He turned to the businessman at the next table, switching effortlessly to German. I caught enough to understand that he was complaining about American service standards, about the entitled attitude of workers who expected respect without earning it. His voice was animated now, engaging, charming. He was performing for his audience, using me as a prop in his demonstration of superiority. I stood there, frozen, as he continued his commentary in German. He was describing me, I realized. The tired middle-aged waitress who exemplified everything wrong with American work ethic. He used words I remembered from my teaching days: ungebildet, uneducated, faul, lazy, überflüssig, superfluous. The businessman laughed at something Franz said. Others were smiling now, enjoying the show, and I realized that this wasn't just about poor service or unmet expectations. This was entertainment for them. I was entertainment, the fool they could mock to make themselves feel superior. Something inside me began to crack. Not break, crack, like ice under too much weight, forming hairline fractures that would eventually shatter the whole surface. Franz was still talking, his German flowing smoothly as he painted me as a symbol of American decline. He talked about the investments he was making in this country, how he was bringing European standards to primitive American markets. He mentioned his cryptocurrency portfolio, his real estate holdings, his plans to acquire more businesses and show them how things should really run. Das Problem ist, he said, his voice carrying clearly, dass solche Leute nie verstehen werden, was excellence bedeutet. The problem is that such people will never understand what excellence means. Then he looked directly at me, his cold smile widening. But of course, you don't understand a word I'm saying, do you? The crack inside me spread. I felt it running through my chest like a fissure in a dam. All those years of swallowing pride, of accepting that I was less than, that my past didn't matter, that I deserved whatever treatment I received because I was just a waitress. Franz leaned back in his chair, enjoying his moment of triumph. It must be frustrating, he said, now speaking English again for everyone's benefit, to have people discussing you in a language you can't comprehend, rather like how you must feel about discussions of real business, real money, real success. He gestured to his expensive watch, his perfectly tailored suit. You see things like this every day, don't you? Wealth, success, achievement, but you can never truly understand them because you've never experienced them. You're forever on the outside, serving those who actually matter. The crack was widening now. I could feel something rising up inside me, something I'd kept buried for 6 long years. The woman who had once commanded classrooms, who had lectured on German philosophy, who had translated Rilke's poetry at conferences in Berlin. Franz turned back to his German companion, ready to continue his performance. Wie ich bereits sagte, das ist das Problem mit Amerika. Zu viele unqualifizierte Menschen in Positionen, wo sie Qualität beurteilen sollen. As I was saying, that's the problem with America. Too many unqualified people in positions where they're supposed to judge quality. He paused, savoring his own cleverness. But I suppose we shouldn't expect more from someone whose greatest achievement is memorizing a menu. That's when the dam burst. The crack became a chasm, and everything I'd buried came rushing to the surface like water breaking through concrete. I stepped closer to his table. My voice, when it came, was steady and clear, and it wasn't in English. Sie irren sich gewaltig, Herr Altenberg. Ich verstehe jedes Wort, das Sie gesagt haben. Und ich muss sagen, für jemanden, der so viel über Exzellenz spricht, zeigen Sie bemerkenswert wenig Klasse. You are gravely mistaken, Mr. Altenberg. I understand every word you've said, and I must say, for someone who talks so much about excellence, you show remarkably little class. The silence that followed was absolute. Franz's face went from confident smirk to shocked pallor in the space of a heartbeat. His German companion's mouth fell open. The businessman at the next table stopped mid-chew. But I wasn't finished. 6 years of swallowed words came pouring out in the language I'd once loved, taught, lived in. Ihre Arroganz ist nur von ihrer Ignoranz übertroffen. Sie sitzen hier und beurteilen Menschen, ohne auch nur zu versuchen, sie zu verstehen. Das ist nicht Exzellenz, Herr Altenberg. Das ist die Dummheit des Privilegs. Your arrogance is only exceeded by your ignorance. You sit here judging people without even trying to understand them. That is not excellence, Mr. Altenberg. That is the stupidity of privilege. Franz tried to speak, but I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Ich habe 20 Jahre lang deutsche Literatur unterrichtet. Ich habe 3 Bücher über Goethe veröffentlicht. Ich spreche 4 Sprachen fließend. Aber Sie sehen nur eine Kellnerin, weil das alles ist, was Ihr kleiner Geist erfassen kann. I taught German literature for 20 years. I've published 3 books on Goethe. I speak 4 languages fluently. But you see only a waitress because that's all your small mind can grasp. the restaurant was dead silent. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, as if the entire world had stopped to listen. Franz was staring at me like I'd suddenly sprouted wings. Sie sprechen über amerikanische Standards, I continued, my German crisp and precise. Aber wahre Klasse, wahre Exzellenz, beginnt mit Respekt für andere Menschen. Etwas, das sie offenbar nie gelernt haben, trotz all ihrem Geld. You talk about American standards. But true class, true excellence, begins with respect for other people. Something you apparently never learned, despite all your money. I straightened up, smoothing my apron with hands that no longer shook. The woman who had once lectured halls full of graduate students was back, and she had something to say. Ihr Vermögen, ihre Investitionen, ihr Bitcoin, ihre Aktienportfolios, all das macht sie reich, Herr Altenberg. Aber es macht sie nicht besser als irgendjemand anderen in diesem Raum. Geld kann vieles kaufen, aber anscheinend keinen Anstand. Your fortune, your investments, your Bitcoin, your stock portfolios, all of that makes you wealthy, Mr. Altenberg. But it doesn't make you better than anyone else in this room. Money can buy many things, but apparently not decency. Franz's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. His carefully constructed persona of European superiority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. I leaned slightly closer, my voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried throughout the silent restaurant. Und noch etwas, Herr Altenberg. Die nächste Mal, wenn Sie jemanden in einer fremden Sprache beleidigen wollen, sollten Sie vielleicht zuerst sicherstellen, dass Sie wirklich die intelligenteste Person im Raum sind. And one more thing, Mr. Altenberg. The next time you want to insult someone in a foreign language, perhaps you should first make sure you're actually the smartest person in the room. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity. Then slowly, applause began. It started with the elderly woman at table 6, the one who always ordered herbal tea and read philosophy books while she ate. Then the young couple by the window joined in. Within moments, the entire restaurant was clapping. Franz sat frozen, his face cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light. Shock, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been respect. His German companion was looking at him with obvious disapproval, shaking his head at the display they'd just witnessed. I stood there, breathing hard, feeling more alive than I had in 6 years. The applause washed over me like warm rain after a drought. People were smiling at me. Not through me, not around me, but at me, seeing me for the first time. But the moment couldn't last forever. Richard came bustling over, his face red with panic. A scene like this was his worst nightmare. Customers embarrassed, the restaurant's refined atmosphere shattered by staff drama. Helen, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, I need to see you in my office, now. I nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through my German soliloquy was fading, leaving behind the reality of what I'd just done. I'd probably lost my job. The bills wouldn't pay themselves. Tommy's college expenses wouldn't disappear because I'd finally found my voice. But as I walked toward Richard's office, passing table after table of customers who looked at me with new eyes, I realized something had changed. I'd changed. The invisible waitress was gone, replaced by someone I'd almost forgotten existed. Franz called out as I passed his table. Wait. I turned back, expecting anger, threats, demands for my immediate dismissal. Instead, he stood up. In front of the entire restaurant, Franz Altenberg, multi-millionaire cryptocurrency mogul, real estate empire builder, extended his hand to me. My apologies, he said quietly, speaking English now but with none of his earlier arrogance. You are absolutely right. I was inexcusably rude. I stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then slowly, I took it. Apology accepted, I said in English, then added in German, aber vergessen Sie diese Lektion nicht. But don't forget this lesson. He actually smiled at that. A real smile, not the cold, calculated expression he'd worn before. "I won't." Richard was less forgiving. In his cramped office behind the kitchen, he paced back and forth like a caged animal, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. "You humiliated a customer, Helen, a very important customer. Do you have any idea what kind of money Franz Altenberg spends here? What kind of connections he has?" I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from his desk, still feeling the echo of applause in my ears. "He was humiliating me first," I said quietly. "That's not the point." Richard's voice rose to a near shriek. "The customer is always right, Helen, always. No matter what they say, no matter how they treat you, your job is to smile and serve. That's what we pay you for." "Pay me." I almost laughed at that. The pittance I earned at the Astoria barely covered my rent, let alone anything else. I'd been surviving on tips and pure stubbornness for 6 years. So I'm supposed to stand there and let him call me stupid? Let him mock me in a language he thought I didn't understand? Richard stopped pacing and fixed me with a look of pure exasperation. "Yes, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. You're a waitress, Helen. Not a professor, not a philosopher, not whatever you think you are. You're hired to serve food and keep your mouth shut." The words hit like physical blows. Not a professor. Not whatever you think you are. Just a waitress who should keep her mouth shut. "I was a professor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I had a PhD. I published books. I taught graduate students who went on to become professors themselves." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "That was then. This is now. And now. You're a waitress who just cost me a very valuable customer relationship." He sat down behind his desk, pulling out a folder I recognized as my employee file. My heart sank as I watched him flip through pages, performance reviews, schedule changes, the documentation of 6 years of my life reduced to bureaucratic paperwork. "I'm sorry, Helen, but I have to let you go. You've been a decent employee most of the time, but this kind of behavior is unacceptable. I can't have staff members arguing with customers no matter what the provocation." The words came without surprise, but they still felt like a punch to the gut. I'd known this was coming the moment I opened my mouth in German, but knowing something and experiencing it are two different things entirely. "When?" I asked. "Now. Today. Finish out your shift, and that's it. I'll have your final paycheck ready by closing." I nodded, standing up on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. 6 years of my life, dismissed with a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes. 6 years of being invisible, and the moment I became visible, I was erased entirely. "Richard," I said as I reached for the door handle, "that man was wrong about one thing. There is pride in this work. There's pride in serving people, in making their day a little better, in doing a job well even when no one notices. The problem isn't the work. It's people who think the work makes you less than human." He didn't respond. He was already looking at his computer screen, probably calculating how quickly he could replace me. I walked back into the dining room with my head held high. Franz was gone, his table cleared and reset for the next customer. But others were still there, and as I moved between them, collecting plates and refilling glasses, something had changed. They looked at me now. Really looked at me. The elderly woman with the philosophy book caught my arm as I passed. "That was magnificent," she whispered. "I've been watching that man's type lord it over service workers for years. It's about time someone stood up to them." A businessman at another table left me a $100 tip with a note that simply said, "Thank you for your courage." The young couple by the window asked me about my books, genuinely interested in what I'd written about Goethe. For 15 minutes, I stood by their table discussing German literature, feeling like myself again for the first time in years. But each conversation was bittersweet because I knew it was ending. This brief moment of visibility, of being seen as a complete person rather than just a service function, would end with my shift. As closing time approached, I went through the familiar motions of shutting down my section, wiping tables, stacking chairs, checking that the salt shakers were filled for tomorrow's servers who wouldn't include me. Maria, one of the younger waitresses, found me in the supply closet as I was hanging up my apron for the last time. "Is it true?" she asked. "That Richard fired you?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "That's not right," she said fiercely. "What you did today, standing up to that arrogant jerk, that took real guts. We all wanted to say something, but none of us were brave enough." "Being brave doesn't pay the bills," I said, trying for lightness but failing. "Maybe not. But it pays something else, something more important." I looked at her, this young woman who still believed that courage mattered more than economic survival. Once I'd believed that too. "What will you do now?" she asked. I honestly didn't know. At 55, with a gap in my resume and a reputation for causing trouble, who would hire me? The academic world I'd left behind had moved on without me. The service industry I was leaving behind wouldn't welcome me back after word spread about my confrontation with a customer. "I'll figure something out," I said, because that's what you say when you have no idea what comes next, but need to sound like you do. I collected my final paycheck from Richard, 2 weeks' pay that wouldn't even cover a month's rent, and walked out of the Astoria Bistro for the last time. The autumn evening was crisp, the city lights beginning to twinkle as Manhattan settled into its nighttime rhythm. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking back at the restaurant where I'd spent 6 years of my life. Through the windows, I could see the familiar scene: servers attending to late diners, busboys clearing tables, the eternal dance of hospitality that would continue with or without me. For 6 years, I'd been part of that dance, invisible but essential. Now I was neither. I was just a middle-aged woman with no job, no prospects, and no idea what tomorrow would bring. But I was also something else. I was someone who had remembered her own voice, someone who had stood up for her own dignity, someone who had refused to disappear completely even when the cost was everything. That had to count for something. That had to be worth something. As I walked toward the subway, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I almost deleted it. Probably spam or a wrong number. But something made me open it. "Ms. Miller, this is Franz Altenberg. I obtained your number from the restaurant manager. I would very much like to speak with you. Would you be available for coffee tomorrow morning? I promise, this time I will be a better listener than talker." I stared at the message for a full minute, reading it over and over. Franz Altenberg wanted to have coffee with me. The man who had humiliated me, who had indirectly cost me my job, who represented everything I'd learned to resent about wealth and privilege. What could he possibly want to say that hadn't already been said? But as I descended into the subway, feeling the familiar rumble of the train approaching, I realized I was curious, not hopeful. I wasn't naive enough to think this was some kind of fairy tale where the cruel millionaire suddenly became my savior, but curious about what he wanted, about what he'd learned from our encounter. I typed back a simple response: "Tomorrow at 10 a.m., Cafe Luna on 82nd and Lexington." His reply came immediately: "I'll be there. And Helen, thank you." Thank me? For what? For teaching him that waitresses were human beings. For showing him that his money didn't make him immune to consequences, for giving him a story he could tell at dinner parties about the fascinating waitress who spoke perfect German. I didn't know what to expect from our meeting, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't be going as the invisible woman who had served his lunch. I'd be going as Helen Müller, former professor of German literature, current unemployed woman, and recent discoverer of her own voice. Whatever Franz Altenberg had to say, he'd be saying it to all of me, not just the parts that made him comfortable. The subway car was crowded with evening commuters, people heading home from their own jobs, their own daily struggles with dignity and survival. I looked at their faces and wondered how many of them had voices they'd forgotten how to use, how many had parts of themselves they'd locked away because the world didn't seem to want them. Tomorrow, I'd find out what Franz Altenberg wanted. Tonight, I'd go home to my small apartment and try to figure out what Helen Miller wanted. It had been so long since I'd asked myself that question, I wasn't sure I'd recognize the answer. But for the first time in 6 years, I was ready to find out. The next morning came gray and drizzly, typical October weather that matched my uncertain mood. I dressed carefully. Not in my waitress uniform, but in a simple gray sweater and black pants that had once been part of my teaching wardrobe. Looking in the mirror, I tried to see myself through Franz's eyes. Would he see the professor I'd once been, or just the out-of-work waitress I'd become overnight? Café Luna was a small place on the Upper East Side, the kind of neighborhood coffee shop that served actual coffee instead of $20 artisanal beverages. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table by the window where I could watch for Franz's arrival. He showed up precisely at 10, looking less imposing than he had in the restaurant. Without the backdrop of luxury and the audience of impressed diners, he seemed smaller somehow, more human. He wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt. Expensive, I was sure, but understated. "Ms. Muller," he said, approaching my table with obvious hesitation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "It's Helen," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "And I'll admit, I'm curious to hear what you have to say." He sat down carefully, like he was afraid the chair might collapse under the weight of his guilt. When the server came over, a young man about Tommy's age, Franz ordered coffee with the kind of polite respect I'd never seen him show at the Astoria. "First," he said once we were alone, "I owe you a much more thorough apology than the one I gave yesterday. My behavior was inexcusable. Completely inexcusable." I waited. Saying nothing. He'd asked for this meeting. He could do the talking. "I've been thinking all night about what you said, about privilege and ignorance, about making assumptions based on someone's job rather than seeing them as a complete person." He paused, running his hand through his hair. "You were right. About all of it." "Why?" I asked. "Why did you feel the need to humiliate me in front of a room full of people?" Franz was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. "Honestly? Because I could. Because in my world, service workers are invisible. They exist to make my life easier, and I never have to think about them as real people with real lives and real feelings." He looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected in his eyes. Shame. That sounds horrible when I say it out loud. "It is horrible," I said quietly, "but at least you can admit it. The thing is, I knew better. My mother was a cleaning woman when I was young, before my father's business took off. I watched her come home exhausted every night, watched her cry when employers treated her badly. I swore I'd never forget where I came from." He laughed bitterly. "But success has a way of making you forget inconvenient truths about yourself. The more money I made, the more I convinced myself that I deserved to look down on people who had less, like somehow my wealth proved I was inherently better." I thought about that for a moment. "What changed your mind? What made you realize you were wrong?" "You did, when you started speaking German. Perfect, elegant German. Better than most native speakers I know. It was like the ground shifted under my feet. Suddenly, you weren't just the waitress anymore. You were a real person with a history and intelligence and dignity that I'd completely ignored." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I went home and looked you up online. Dr. Helen Muller, published author, respected academic. 20 years at Columbia University before you took a leave of absence. And I realized that even if you'd never been a professor, even if you'd been serving tables your whole life, you still would have deserved basic human respect." "So why did it take learning about my background to see that?" I asked. Why wasn't the fact that I'm a human being enough? The question hung between us like a challenge. Franz was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. "Because I'm an ass," he said finally. "A privileged, arrogant ass who forgot that success is as much about luck and circumstance as it is about merit. My cryptocurrency investments made me rich because I got in early, not because I'm smarter than everyone else. My real estate portfolio expanded because I inherited seed money from my father. My tech investments paid off because I had connections through my university network." He shook his head ruefully. "You know what's really ironic? I built my fortune partly through investing in companies that employ millions of service workers. I've made money off the labor of people exactly like you, while simultaneously treating them like they don't matter." I found myself almost feeling sorry for him. Almost. So what now? Are you expecting absolution? Forgiveness that makes you feel better about yourself? "No," he said quickly. "I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not looking to ease my conscience. I want to make things right if that's possible. I lost my job because of yesterday." "I know. I called the restaurant manager this morning and tried to get him to reconsider, but he said the decision was final." Franz's jaw tightened. I also told him what I thought of his management style and his treatment of staff. I don't think the Astoria Bistro will be getting any more of my business. That's something, I suppose. It's not enough. Not nearly enough. Franz leaned back in his chair, studying me intently. "Can I ask you something? Why did you leave teaching?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't talked about that time in my life with anyone in years. It was too painful. Too tangled up with memories of failure and loss. "Personal reasons," I said carefully. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to pry, it's just, from what I read about your work, you were respected in your field. Published, tenured, successful. What happened?" Maybe it was the genuine curiosity in his voice, or maybe I just needed to tell someone who might actually listen. But I found myself answering. "My husband left, suddenly, without warning, for his 25-year-old graduate student. The divorce was nasty. He had better lawyers, more connections. I lost the house, most of our savings, and my confidence in my own judgment." I stared out the window at people hurrying past in the drizzle. I started having panic attacks in class. The university granted me a leave of absence, but I never went back. Couldn't face the whispered conversations, the pity, the knowledge that everyone was talking about my personal failures. "So, you took a job as a waitress?" "It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But getting back on your feet is harder than you think when you're 50 and emotionally shattered and competing with people half your age for academic positions." Franz nodded slowly. "And you've been invisible ever since." "Pretty much." I met his eyes across the table. "Until yesterday." "Until yesterday," he agreed. "Helen, I know this might sound presumptuous, but I have a proposition for you." Here it comes, I thought. The offer that comes with strings attached, the helping hand that turns into another leash. "I'm listening," I said cautiously. "I'm opening a new restaurant, high-end, focused on authentic European cuisine, but with American sensibilities. I need someone to help me develop the concept, someone who understands both cultures intimately, someone who could ensure that the staff are treated with respect and dignity." I blinked at him. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a partnership, 25% ownership, full authority over hiring and staff development, input on everything from menu design to interior decoration, your academic background, your language skills, your experience in both the front and back of house. They're exactly what I need." The offer was so unexpected, so far from anything I'd imagined, that I couldn't process it immediately. "Why?" I asked finally. "Why would you want to partner with someone you humiliated yesterday?" "Because you humiliated me right back, and I deserved it. Because you stood up for yourself when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Because you understand both sides. what it's like to serve, and what it's like to be served. Franz's expression was earnest, almost vulnerable. And because I think I can learn something from you about how to treat people with dignity. I stared at him, looking for the catch, the hidden agenda, the trap that would make this too good to be true offer make sense. "This isn't charity," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "This is business. I'm investing millions of dollars in this restaurant, and I want it to succeed. I think your involvement would give us something unique, a place where excellent food and service come without the dehumanizing attitude that pervades most high-end establishments. You want to hire me to teach you how not to be an ass to your employees?" Franz actually laughed at that. Among other things, yes, though I prefer to think of it as creating a culture of mutual respect. I found myself smiling despite everything. There was something appealing about the idea of creating a workplace where people like Maria didn't have to choose between dignity and employment. "Tell me more about this restaurant," I said. For the next hour, Franz laid out his vision, a place that would serve sophisticated European cuisine without the pretension that usually accompanied it, a restaurant where servers would be treated as professionals, where the kitchen staff would have living wages and benefits, where customers who treated employees badly would be asked to leave. "It sounds idealistic," I said when he finished. "Maybe it is, but maybe idealism is what's been missing from my approach to business. Maybe making money and treating people well aren't mutually exclusive." I thought about Tommy, about his student loans and the future I wanted to help him build. I thought about Maria and the other servers still working at the Astoria, still swallowing indignities for the sake of paychecks that barely covered their basic needs. If I said yes, and I'm not saying yes yet, what would be my actual responsibilities? Everything related to service and staff, hiring, training, creating policies and procedures. You'd also work with our head chef on menu development and wine selection. Essentially, you'd be my partner in creating the entire dining experience. And you'd really give me 25% ownership? We'd have contracts drawn up, everything legal and binding. Your share would include profit participation and equity in the property itself. If the restaurant succeeds, you succeed. It was tempting, more than tempting, but I'd learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. "I need time to think about it," I said. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Franz reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "My personal number is on there. Call me when you've decided whether it's yes or no." As we prepared to leave, Franz hesitated. "Helen, can I ask you one more question?" "Sure." "Yesterday, when you were speaking German, where did that confidence come from? I mean, you'd been accepting poor treatment from customers for years, according to what you told me. What made that moment different?" I thought about it as I put on my coat. Maybe I just reached my limit. Or maybe hearing my own language reminded me of who I used to be. When you spoke German, you became more animated, more yourself. Maybe the same thing happened to me. You became yourself again. For a few minutes, yes. And now? I looked at him, really looked at him. The arrogant millionaire from yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely interested in becoming better. Now I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by other people's expectations. Franz nodded. That's probably the most important work any of us can do. We parted ways outside the cafe, Franz heading north toward his penthouse, me heading south toward the subway and home. But as I walked, I realized something had shifted. The conversation with Franz had been more than an apology or even a job offer. It had been a recognition, not just of what I could do, but of who I was. For 6 years, I'd defined myself by what I'd lost: my marriage, my career, my financial security, my sense of self-worth. But yesterday, for those few minutes in the restaurant, I'd been defined by what I still had: my intelligence, my knowledge, my refusal to be diminished. Maybe Franz's offer was legitimate, or maybe it was elaborate, guilt-driven charity. Maybe the restaurant would succeed, or maybe it would fail spectacularly. But one thing was certain. I wasn't the same woman who had tied on her apron yesterday morning, hoping to get through another shift unnoticed. That woman was gone. In her place was someone I was still getting to know. 3 days later, I called Franz and said yes. 6 months after that, we opened Dignity, a restaurant that served exceptional food in an atmosphere of mutual respect. Our servers were college graduates and seasoned professionals who earned living wages and benefits. Our kitchen staff included refugees and immigrants whose culinary traditions enriched our menu beyond anything either Franz or I could have imagined alone. On opening night, Franz insisted I address our staff before service began. Standing in the dining room we'd designed together, elegant but warm, sophisticated but welcoming, I looked at the faces of our team. 6 months ago, I was fired from a restaurant job for standing up to a customer who was treating me poorly. I began. Today, we're opening a place where that will never happen. Not because the customer is never right, but because everyone who walks through our doors, staff and guests alike, deserves to be treated with respect. The evening was a success beyond our wildest expectations. Food critics loved the innovative menu. Business leaders appreciated the professional service. But what made me proudest was watching our servers interact with guests as equals, knowledgeable professionals who enhanced the dining experience rather than invisible servants who detracted from it. Near the end of the evening, as we were winding down service, I noticed a familiar face at table 12. Maria from the Astoria Bistro was dining with her boyfriend, celebrating her college graduation. I walked over to their table, no longer wearing an apron, but dressed in the professional attire of a restaurant owner. "Maria," I said, smiling, "how wonderful to see you here." She looked up at me with surprise and delight. "Helen, I heard about your new place, but I couldn't believe it was really you. This is incredible." We talked for a few minutes about her graduation, her plans for the future, her amazement at how different the atmosphere was at Dignity compared to the Astoria. As I was about to leave, she caught my arm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For showing me that we don't have to accept being treated badly, that we don't have to be invisible. After what you did that day," I started standing up for myself more. I quit the Astoria 2 months later and found a job where they actually respect their employees. As I walked back toward the kitchen, I passed Franz, who was saying goodbye to a group of investors who'd come to check out his new venture. "How do you think it went?" he asked when they'd left. "I think we might actually pull this off," I said. "We did pull this off. Tonight was just the beginning." He was right. Over the next year, Dignity became one of Manhattan's most sought-after reservations. Food and Wine magazine featured us in their Restaurants That Are Changing the Industry issue. The New York Times restaurant critic wrote that we'd revolutionize the fine dining experience by treating everyone involved, from dishwashers to diners, as human beings deserving of respect. But the success story that mattered most to me was smaller and more personal. Tommy came to dinner at Dignity 6 months after opening, bringing his girlfriend to meet me. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," he said as I showed them around the restaurant after service. "Not just because the place is successful, but because you found yourself again." "I never lost myself," I said. "I just forgot where I'd put me for a while." That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in the dining room, looking at the space we'd created. It was beautiful, sophisticated enough for special occasions, warm enough for comfort, professional enough for business dinners. But what made it special wasn't the decor or even the food. It was the knowledge that everyone who worked here could do so with dignity, that no one had to swallow insults for the sake of their paycheck. That service work could be honorable work when it was respected and valued appropriately. Franz found me there, quietly contemplating our achievement. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About which part? Getting fired? Meeting you? Taking this risk?" "Any of it. All of it." I thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, I'd been a 55-year-old unemployed waitress with no prospects and a pile of unpaid bills. Now I was a restaurant owner, a respected member of the culinary community, and someone who woke up eager to go to work each day. No regrets, I said finally. Even the painful parts led to this. Even me being an ass to you that day? Especially that. If you hadn't challenged me, if you hadn't pushed me to my breaking point, I might never have found my voice again. Franz nodded. I've learned something from working with you this past year. What's that? That dignity isn't something you can grant to someone else. It's something everyone possesses naturally. The question is whether you choose to see it and honor it. As we locked up and headed home through the midnight streets of Manhattan, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From invisible waitress to restaurant owner, from silenced woman to confident partner, from someone who served others' dreams to someone who built her own. The city looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. The same streets that once felt like a maze of disappointment now seemed full of possibility. The same lights that once highlighted my isolation now illuminated paths I hadn't seen before. I thought about all the women like my former self, invisible servers, overlooked workers, dismissed dreamers. How many of them had voices they'd forgotten how to use? How many had stories worth telling, wisdom worth sharing, dignity worth defending? Maybe that was the real success of dignity. Not just creating one restaurant where people were treated well, but proving that it was possible. Showing that business success and human decency weren't opposing forces, but complementary ones. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Maria, who now worked as a manager at a boutique hotel in Brooklyn. Saw the Times review of Dignity today. You're changing the world one meal at a time. Thank you for showing me it was possible. I smiled, tucking the phone back into my purse. Changing the world felt like too grand a claim for what we'd accomplished. But changing a few lives, creating a small oasis of respect in an industry known for its casual cruelties, that felt real and meaningful and sustainable. Franz had taught me something too, though I'd never tell him in quite these words, that even the most privileged and arrogant among us can grow and change when confronted with truth. That apologies mean nothing without changed behavior, but when the behavior actually changes, they can mean everything. As I descended into the subway for my familiar ride home, I caught my reflection in the train window. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the invisible waitress who had tied on her apron just 18 months before. This woman stood straighter, smiled more readily, met the world's gaze without flinching. She had work she loved, respect she'd earned, and most importantly, a voice she'd never lose again. The train pulled into my station, and I climbed the stairs toward street level, toward home, toward whatever tomorrow would bring. But unlike the old days when tomorrow felt like another day to survive, now it felt like another day to thrive. Behind me, the city hummed with its endless energy. Millions of people pursuing their dreams, fighting their battles, searching for their place in the world. Among them were countless invisible workers, unnoticed servers, and forgotten voices. Maybe some of them would find their way to dignity, where they'd be seen and valued. Maybe they'd be inspired to demand better treatment elsewhere. Maybe they'd remember their own worth and refuse to accept anything less. Or maybe they'd just have one meal where they felt respected as human beings, and that small dignity would ripple outward in ways we'd never know. Either way, it would be enough. We'd proven that change was possible. One conversation at a time, one employee at a time, one customer at a time. The invisible waitress was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that being seen wasn't something you waited for someone else to grant you. It was something you claimed for yourself, defended for others, and built into the very foundation of how you moved through the world. And once you'd learned that lesson, you could never unlearn it. Never become invisible again. Never forget that your voice, however long it had been silent, was worth hearing. As I walked the final blocks to my apartment, I realized that Franz's challenge that day, translated if you can, had been about more than language. It had been an invitation to translate my experience, my knowledge, my worth into something the world couldn't ignore. I'd taken that challenge and turned it into something he'd never expected. Not just a translation, but a transformation. Not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated as less than human because of what they did for a living. Maybe you've been there too, serving others while your own dreams went unfed, working jobs that paid the bills but cost you pieces of your soul, accepting treatment that you knew was wrong because you needed the income more than you needed the dignity. If so, I want you to know, your voice matters. Your experience has value. Your dignity is not negotiable, no matter what your job title says, no matter how much you need the work, no matter who tells you to be grateful for what you have. The world needs servers, cleaners, caregivers, and all the other workers who keep society functioning. But it also needs to remember that these workers are complete human beings with intelligence, dreams, histories, and voices worth hearing. Sometimes finding your voice means speaking up in the moment, like I did with Franz. Sometimes it means walking away from situations that diminish you. Sometimes it means building something better, something that honors everyone involved. But it always means remembering that you are more than your job, more than your current circumstances, more than whatever role the world has assigned you. You are a full human being, deserving of respect, dignity, and the chance to be seen for who you really are. Have you ever felt invisible in your work? Have you swallowed insults for the sake of a paycheck or watched others be treated poorly because they were just doing service work? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps this message reach other women who serve with heart and soul, who deserve to be seen and valued. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it here by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. Until we meet again, remember, you are never invisible to those who matter, and your voice, however long it's been silent, is always worth hearing. I'll see you in the next story.